Former President Richard Nixon in his first appearance on a Sunday interview program in 20 years. Today, he'll talk about the '88 campaign, U.S.-Soviet relations, and his place in history.
From Washington, NBC News presents Meet the Press with Chris Wallace.
Good day, and welcome to a special one-hour edition of Meet the Press. Our guest today, former President Richard Nixon, who was last on this program on November 3rd, 1968, just 2 days before he was elected president. Mr. Nixon, who is now 75, has just written his seventh book, 1999, Victory Without War. Joining me today, two of my NBC colleagues, Tom Brokaw and John Chancellor. And Mr. President, welcome. Thank you very much for joining us after much too long a time. We're delighted to have you with us. And as we welcome you, I should also note that your first appearance on Meet the Press was back in September of 1952 when you were running for vice president, and we thought you might like to take a look at a brief clip from that program.
Ladies and gentlemen, our guest on Meet the Press is Senator Richard Nixon, Republican of California.
I predict that millions of Democrats this year, both North and South, are going to put their country above their party and vote for General Eisenhower. And I believe that that's going to be the decisive factor in an Eisenhower victory.
Well, Mr. President, what do you think of that fellow compared to the politicians you see these days?
Well, that's one of the first times I've ever seen myself on television. As I was telling you before the show began, I simply have a phobia about that. But I must say I looked a bit younger then, but I was.
Well, this, of course, is another election year, and we thought we would begin with politics. And before we get into personalities, I'd like to ask you a little bit about the issues of the '88 campaign. There is an axiom in American politics that peace and prosperity are usually the key issues. Given the fact that the economy is relatively sound, given the fact that U.S.-Soviet relations are on track, shouldn't this be a landslide election year for George Bush?
It normally should be, because peace and prosperity is always a winner. It was, for example, a winner for President Eisenhower when he ran for re-election in 1956. I was running with him. I know how powerful an issue it is. But sometimes it is not enough. De Tocqueville, many years ago, who, as we know, predicted that the United States and the Soviet Union were going to be adversaries and change the world in the next century. He said that about one of the characteristics of American democracy was restlessness amidst prosperity. And I think we have some of that today. I think that's one of the reasons Jesse Jackson has such appeal. He's appealing to those who are restless despite prosperity. And that is what George Bush must overcome, and that's why I think it's going to be a close election rather than a landslide.
Perhaps because the economy and international relations are relatively sound. The Democrats are talking about making a big issue this fall of the so-called sleaze factor, the more than 100 Reagan appointees who've been accused of unethical or illegal behavior. Do you think they're going to be able to make the sleaze factor stick this fall?
No. It hasn't rubbed off on Reagan yet, and it will not rub off on George Bush because he has an impeccable record in that respect. If you look at the sleaze factor over the years in politics, it does not have a negative effect on a candidate unless it is accompanied with some other issue, for example, a recession, or, as was the case in 1952, where the Truman 5%ers was an issue, with a Korean War issue. Unless there is something else that people are concerned about, the sleaze factor by itself is not going, I think, to affect the candidate, and particularly not George Bush, because it can't affect him personally.
Let me ask you one more question, though, about the sleaze factor. Attorney General Meese is now under fire, and I can tell you there are a lot of Republicans in this town who would love to see him go. Do you think the president should fire him, and if not, should Meese do the job for the president?
Well, it's a moot question because the president isn't going to fire him. I would say there are three things we have to consider when we consider whether or not the Attorney General should leave. One, is he an honest man? And two, has he been a competent Attorney General? And three, is he a political liability? Now, as far as the first one is concerned, I think he's an honest man. As far as the second matter is concerned, President Reagan believes he's a competent Attorney General in carrying out his conservative agenda. The third point, however, is the one you're really addressing, and that is he a political liability? And that's something only he can answer. He is a loyal Reagan supporter, has been for 20 years. He's got to consider all these things. It isn't fair that if he is a competent man And if he is an honest man, that he is a political liability. If he finds he is, that he would have to leave. But that's a decision only he can make.
Mr. President, you told the Wall Street Journal that you don't see in George Bush the drive or the independence to lead the United States in global leadership. You worry that he relies too much on what you call the establishment. Are you suggesting that the Republican Party is about to nominate a weak candidate?
No, I would say certainly not, because he's going to be a strong candidate. I would say, first of all, that I made that statement at the time that Bush was really in the doldrums. You recall the interview was given during the Iowa caucus when he was really down. And since that, George Bush has really come into his own. Winston Churchill has said that there is no part of the education of a politician is more indispensable than the fighting of elections. George Bush has had a very good education in that respect. Coming back from the defeat in Iowa, he has wiped out the opposition, and he's developed that inner strength and toughness that was not certainly there beforehand. I think, Tom, that he therefore is a strong person, but more important, that voters think that. And that's one of the reasons I think that he's going to be a very effective candidate.
Who do you think Mr. Bush should choose for his vice presidential running mate?
Who he should choose?
Yes.
Well, having been a vice president and also having chosen one, I think these are the factors that have to go into that matter. First, the question is, would he make a good president? Second, would he make a good vice president? And third, of course, would he be a good candidate? And of course, the third is always the first, because unless you're a good candidate, you're not going to have a chance to demonstrate either of the other two. I think that that George Bush has a number of good people to select from. Governors like Duke Mason and Thompson and so forth, a fine senator in Alan Simpson. Howard Baker would be a superb president or vice president. I think, however, what he has to consider is who's going to help the ticket. And in that respect, people say he couldn't possibly consider Senator Dole because they don't like each other. And I say that's quite irrelevant. I remember very well back in 1960, I was told that Lyndon Johnson didn't like Jack Kennedy, and Jack Kennedy didn't like Lyndon Johnson, and Bobby Kennedy hated Lyndon Johnson. They took him, they needed him, and they won. It made the difference. And so it is this time. I'm not saying that he ought to take Bob Dole, but he's got to remember that one place he's weak is in the farm states. Bob Dole won Iowa, he lost it. He won Minnesota, he won South Dakota, he would hold Nebraska, he would hold Kansas. So as he considers who to take, he's got to remember that it isn't a question of whether you get along with the person, because believe me, if they win, they'll be bosom buddies thereafter.
You also say that if Bush is elected, he'll only serve for one term, because at age 69, this country is not going to re-elect a 69-year-old man after what they have been through during the second term of Ronald Reagan. What are you saying by that? That the president, during his second term with his advanced age, has not been as on top of complex issues as he ought to be?
No, I wouldn't like to suggest, and I don't mean to suggest, that President Reagan has not been an effective president in his second term because of age. Believe me, if any man handles age well, he does. He gives us all hope when you think of what he's been able to do with age. What I am saying is that, that second terms are not kind to presidents, particularly in this century. We know, for example, the second term was not kind even to Eisenhower, who was enormously popular. A second term was not kind to Harry Truman. We know it wasn't very kind to me. Wasn't kind to Woodrow Wilson, for example, who had very, very serious problems. What I am suggesting here is that after he finishes the first term, if he has a good first term, he will be reelected. But the second term is always very difficult.
John?
If Colonel North and Admiral Poindexter are convicted, should they be pardoned?
The answer to that, of course, is one that only the president should and can give. And the question that he has to ask himself then is, did these two men do what they did, believing, whether mistakenly or not, that they had the approval of the president or were acting in order to serve his interest and would get that approval? If the president, after considering that, believes that that was the case, then he, the president, would have a good case for pardoning, because then the so-called crime would lack an intent.
Well, did you have that? Did those thoughts go through your mind when Haldeman was going to jail and Ehrlichman? They worked for you.
They certainly did. And it was a very, very difficult decision for me. Looking back, I probably should have pardoned them. I'm not sure that the country would have taken it at that time. It was a little stirred up, as you might imagine. But on the other hand, they had not done it for personal gain. That wasn't involved, and that, incidentally, we must make clear, was not involved in the Iran-Contra matter. Nobody made any money out of it. They were doing it because they thought they were serving the country. Haldeman Ehrlichman the same. It was a tragic situation. I wish I could have, but I didn't.
If you were president now, and you were faced with the decision on whether to pardon or not, when would you pardon? When would be politically the best time to do it?
Well, it can't be now, because if it were done now, it would have the effect of being a cover-up for George Bush. And he doesn't need to answer that. The time to do it is sometime, of course, before you leave office, because unless you do it then, you're not going to have the power to do it.
We can't end this segment, Mr. President, without asking you about the other party. You have said that the only thing worse than being wrong in politics is being dull. Is Mike Dukakis too dull to be an effective Democratic nominee?
Let me answer that question this way. I've often said, too, that the best politics is poetry rather than prose. Jesse Jackson is a poet. Cuomo is a poet. And Dukakis is a word processor. That's what it gets down to. On the other hand, he's cool, he's intelligent, he's tough, he's good in debates. He's going to be a very formidable candidate.
All right, you talk about Jesse Jackson, and you have kind of conflicting views because you have said he is one of the best candidates in either party in this century. But on the other hand, you say that if he were white, he'd already be out of the race. Explain that.
Candidacy is very different from being one who should be elected. He's a superb candidate. Huey Long was a very good candidate, too. So was George Wallace. But on the other hand, neither should be president. What you have here is a situation where it isn't really the messenger, the fact that he is black, but it's the message. He is far to the left of the Democrats, and they are already very far to the left with Dukakis. So under the circumstances, if he were white, he would have been out already as being too extreme to have a chance to win. That's what I meant by it.
Mr. President, Mayor Koch says in the New York primary that Jews would have to be crazy to vote for Jesse Jackson. Do you think that that's fair of the mayor to say that?
Jesse Jackson's statements with regard to Hymietown, as we know, with regard to Israel, the fact that he, of course, has dealt with Arafat and others, would give certainly most Jews the idea that he's not one that favors their interest. Now, whether or not he should say that they would be crazy to, I noticed that there was a Jewish organization. Some Jews are endorsing him. So I'm going to suggest, however, that if you're looking at it from the standpoint of Jewish issues, that Jackson has not been on the side of Jewish issues, and that all the other candidates, of course, can't wait but line up for those issues all the way down the line. I think that's the difference.
One very quick one. Democrats win in '88, Republicans win in '88. How does it come out?
It's going to be George Bush, but you're going to have a very long night. It's going to be decided in California, so be planning to spend double time and overtime for your staff over here.
They'll be happy to hear that.
Till the end.
George Bush and Dole over...
Well, I'm not... No, as far as who's going to win,
right,
it's going to be Bush with whoever he happens to select. That it might be Dole, that it might be Kemp, it might be one of the others. It will be, I believe, however, as far as Dukakis is concerned, Dukakis can't win unless he goes south. His first choice should be Nunn. Nunn will help him not only in the South, but also on the issue he's weak on, defense. And his second choice will be Gore.
Mr. President, we have to take a break now, but in a moment we'll turn to foreign policy and the U.S. role in the world. That's coming up when Meet the Press returns.
What I am talking about is not conquering North Vietnam, not destroying North Vietnam, but simply victory over aggression.
Meet the Press, the world's longest-running television program, is sponsored by ADM, Supermarket of the World, and Compaq, maker of the most powerful personal computers. Compaq, it simply works better.
Something we often take for granted would take about 50% more of our disposable income if we lived in France, and 400% more if we lived in India. But here in America, this thing that is so basic to life is still a bargain: food. We have more of it and spend less for it than any other country in the world. thanks to the farmers who raise our crops and the people who process them. At the Archer Daniels Midland Company, we're helping America use its agricultural abundance to not only meet our needs for food, but those of the rest of the world as well, by producing a wide array of flours, sweeteners, vegetable oils, and functional soy protein products. Products that will help keep our most essential purchases affordable. So look at it this way. If you lived anywhere else in the world, the cost of food would be a lot harder to swallow.
Who makes the best personal computers for business? When you rank different models, a startling pattern emerges. The most powerful PC in the world, the most powerful portable in the world, and the most powerful mid-range PCs in the world all have one thing in common. They come from the company whose annual sales reached $1 billion, faster than any other in history. Compaq. It simply works better.
Frog in my throat.
Mr. President, you disagree with some of Ronald Reagan's, the basic tenets of his foreign policy towards the Soviets, and I'd like to get your thinking on that if I could. First of all, the President's notion that Mikhail Gorbachev has renounced the idea of Soviet domination. You don't agree with that?
Well, I don't agree with it because of what Mikhail Gorbachev himself has said. I read very carefully the speech that he made at the 70th anniversary of the Communist Revolution in Russia. And I think I can remember exactly what he said. He said that 70 years ago, we parted with the old world once and for all. We are moving toward a new world, the world of communism. We will never turn off that road. Gorbachev may be a number of things. He may be more reasonable and all the rest, but he certainly has the same goal of a communist world to be accomplished maybe in other ways.
Well, are you troubled to see Ronald Reagan running around the country saying exactly the opposite, that Gorbachev has renounced this goal?
Ronald Reagan is saying that, and I'm sure that he believes it. On the other hand, he is one who is very shrewd, and he is one who, if he gets information which indicates that Gorbachev is not following that line, he'll turn on him very, very fast. So I have confidence that Reagan will handle it well.
You also disagree,
just as he did at Reykjavik.
You also disagree with the President's emotional commitment to a perfect Star Wars defense shield to defend the U.S. against all nuclear missiles.
SDI has served a very useful purpose to date. If it hadn't been for SDI, we wouldn't be having the arms control negotiations we're presently having. But we have to remember, however, that as far as SDI is concerned, what is achievable is not a perfect shield. That research should go forward on that. Maybe we will find something in the next century that will deal with it. But what we can do immediately is to use SDI for the purpose of protecting our deterrent. To think unrealistically that we can substitute SDI for the deterrence of our offensive weapons does not serve American foreign policy well.
I gather you also think that the President has gone along too much with the Soviet agenda, playing along too much with the emphasis on arms control and not linking it enough to progress on human rights and regional conflicts.
Well, the President certainly has been discussing human rights with Gorbachev. I know that from personal conversations I had with the President. And that is the way to handle human rights. Not expressly to condition any progress on arms control, for example, and human rights, but to do so in a private conversations that he's having. As far as other matters are concerned, however, I think what we have to remember is that arms control is the top of the Soviet agenda. That's what they want. The top of our agenda are those actions of the Soviet that make it necessary to have arms. And for example, as far as nuclear arms are concerned, it is the Soviet superiority in conventional weapons that must be dealt with.
Given all of these disagreements, do you have any concerns about the President going to Moscow and sitting down again with Mikhail Gorbachev next month?
No, when the President gets there, and after the President has had his briefings, he is going to be, I think, just as tough as he was at Reykjavik, when after going clear to the edge, a nuclear-free world and the rest, he backed off when Gorbachev insisted that he had to give up SDI. And the man that said no to Gorbachev at Reykjavik is going to say no to Gorbachev at Moscow if he believes that Gorbachev is not making the concessions he should on matters that really involve us. and certainly conventional arms involves us, and also what the Soviet Union does in regional issues, which could lead to the use of arms.
Mr. President, you talk to the President all the time, or with some regularity on the telephone about these matters. This administration, despite your confidence, has rejected linkage in the past of linking, for example, human rights or the Third World or conventional arms to arms control. What makes you so confident that this time the President will insist on those issues?
Well, first time I believe that the rejection of linkage has traditionally been the position of the Foreign Service. The Foreign Service of the State Department didn't agree with our going forward with linkage during our administration. It has always been their position. They believe you should go after this agreement, or that agreement. Now, that isn't the way it works with the Soviets. They link everything in their own minds, and we should do exactly the same thing. What I am saying here, though, that as far as President Reagan is concerned, well, that's the advice he's getting from the Foreign Service, that President Reagan is a very coony politician. And when push comes to shove, I think that he will practice linkage, even though he says he rejects it up to this point, because that's the advice he gets from the professionals.
Mr. President, in your book, as you prepare the readers for what they should expect from the Russians, you quote an Italian diplomat with whom you talked in the late 60s who said, "They are great liars, clever cheaters, magnificent actors. They consider it their duty to cheat and lie." Do you think that Mikhail Gorbachev considers it his duty to cheat and lie?
We have to understand that he is many things. He has great charm, he has high intelligence, and also, as distinguished from some of his predecessors, he's a pragmatist who knows he has serious problems and wants to deal with those problems. Now, insofar as tactics are concerned, you have to remember that anybody that studied the Marxist communist philosophy knows that they adopt the philosophy of any means to an end. Any means to an end, you do anything. You lie, you cheat, you do anything else. So under the circumstances, we've got to remember that as far as he's concerned, he's going to practice that. And as far as we're concerned, all we have to do is to make sure he doesn't get away with it.
Sir, I'd like to take you back to August of 1974, a couple of days before you left the White House. This is from Henry Kissinger's memoirs. He said that on the August the 6th, the Tuesday, President Nixon would cut off all military deliveries to Israel until it agreed to a comprehensive peace. He regretted not having done so earlier. He would make up for it now. His successor would thank him for it. I should prepare the necessary papers. Kissinger says the relevant papers were prepared but never signed. Can you tell me what was going on?
Well, I think what we were concerned there was with the fact that the Israelis were, we thought, intransigent at that point. And that we had to make a very solid, strong play in order to get them to move off of an intransigent position, which I didn't think was in their interest. Let me make a point with regard to Israel. Of course, as you may remember, I saved Israel, as Golda Meir pointed out, through the airlift in 1973. We kept the Russians out through the alert in 1973, and it was a very tough decision and a very tough political decision.
The nuclear alert.
That's right, a nuclear alert. Just as Eisenhower kept them out in 1956 and 1958, with in effect what was nuclear warnings. Now, under the circumstances, what Israel has to understand is that for their own interest, they should make a deal now. Because if they don't make it now, they will wait until later. Now, they won 5 wars, they'll win the next one. But in the end, Arabs will learn to fight, and in the end, there are going to be more of them. And in the end, they will lose. And that's why I think we should, certainly in case of Israel's own interest, we should press them to make the deal now with regard to territories, et cetera, rather than waiting till later till they're forced to make one that will not be in their interest.
If you had been Senator Nixon this year in the U.S. Senate, would you have signed that letter of support for George Shultz's mission? 30 senators signed it.
No, I wouldn't have signed it. I would have agreed with what they were trying to do, but I wouldn't have signed it because I think that had a counterproductive effect insofar as the Israelis are concerned. You don't deal with them in a heavy-handed way. Shamir's a very proud man, and the minute the letter came out, he reacted exactly the opposite way. When I say, however, the sentiments I well understand, I certainly understand the sentiments, and I know why they signed it, but I wouldn't have signed it myself because I think it would have been bad tactics.
Before we move away from the Middle East, you say that the Palestinians need self-government, but no separate homeland. How does that work?
What you have to be concerned about here is that Israel cannot have an armed Palestinian state in its gut. That's really what the issue is. On the other hand, Palestinians cannot continue to have Israelis ruling over them. And so the Palestinians must have, and I think the term that I use is not so much a homeland, self-government. And by self-government, I mean that they've got to have a system set up whereby they govern themselves. But it must be a neutral government. It must be one that poses no threat to Israel or to its neighbors. And that, incidentally, is in Israel's interest. But I should also say that accompanying that, Israel must have defensible borders. This idea that Israel should give up all the occupied territories, that won't fly with Israel, and it shouldn't. That has to be negotiated.
Mr. President, how well do you think President Reagan is handling the situation in Panama? And at what point, or at any point, should he be willing to use force, military force, to get General Noriega out?
I think he's handling it very well. I know that there are those who believe that he should use military force. I think it'd be a mistake. Noriega is an irritant to us, but we want to remember that in getting rid of that irritant, we don't want to cause much greater difficulties. In other words, the reaction that would occur all over Latin America in the event we used our military force to get rid of this irritant. What we have to do is to get rid of Noriega, but to have the Panamanian people do it, rather than the U.S. do it.
Are you convinced that the economic tools that the President is using are going to force Noriega out?
Economic, diplomatic, and there's one other thing that I haven't seen suggested that I would like to suggest in this program. I've noticed that several Latin American countries have objected to the United States even using their economic power. They think that's improper for us to go that far. Why don't they then, in their interest, they know that Noriega ought to go, they ought to use their influence with Noriega to get him to go. I'd like to see the Latins start to do something about their own problem.
Could you envision a situation where the situation in Panama is so unstable that the U.S. would have to rethink giving the canal over to the Panamanians?
I do not think that is going to happen. I think the Panamanians are going to be realistic enough that before that happens, which of course would destroy their livelihood, that they're going to move on it themselves. But I emphasize again, the United States cannot be heavy-handed in Latin America, particularly with the Noriega, as indicated, I think, by what has happened in Honduras. They have a riot. What was it about? It was about somebody that was thrown out of the country because of drugs. We've got to recognize what they are. We must deal with them as effectively as we can, but sometimes it's much better to do it in a way that gets others to do the work for you. In this case, the Panamanians or other Latin American governments, rather than the U.S. going in and doing it.
Mr. President, we have to pause for a moment, but we have many more questions for you, and we'll get to them when Meet the Press returns.
Now, the question is not whether Senator Kennedy or I believe that religion is an issue. We don't believe it is. Not that we believe whether we believe it should be an issue. Both of us believe it should not be an issue. The question is, how do you keep it out of a campaign?
Who would you say is the most successful company? The one with the greatest first-year sales in American business history? The one that reached the Fortune 500 faster than any company in history? Or the one whose annual sales reached $1 billion faster than any company in history? It's not a difficult choice. The same company holds each record. The company that makes the world's most powerful personal computers, Compaq. It simply works better.
You've got the whole world in your hand. You've got the whole wide world in your hand. You've got the whole world in your hand. You've got the whole world in your hand.
Put the whole world in your hand with Radio Shack's new portable cellular phone. A price and technology breakthrough.
You've got the whole world in your hand.
Only at Radio Shack, the technology store.
Who would you say makes the best personal computers for business? The brand being added by the most major corporations? The one rated highest in performance by computer experts? The one that won the most industry awards? or the one that's grown the fastest? Hard coal, right? Not really. In each case, the answer is Compact. It simply works better.
I figured, I don't need a high school diploma.
Will our school system make America a second-rate nation?
This is a survival issue for our country.
How can we compete when too many students either don't finish high school in this country or graduate with no skills? I'm Tom Brokaw. A three-part report on this problem begins tomorrow on NBC Nightly News.
Meet the Press is sponsored by Radio Shack Computer Centers, in business for business, and ADM, supermarket to the world.
Mr. President, I wanted to ask you one last follow-up question on the Mideast. Do you think that Secretary of State Schultz has accomplished anything in these weeks of shuttle diplomacy there?
You have to give him very high marks for trying. And incidentally, he's an excellent negotiator, as he demonstrated when he was serving as Secretary of Labor and handled George Meany for us in that period. I would say, however, we have to realize that the problems in the Mideast are so complex that it can't be done by the Secretary of State on a part-time basis, and it can't be done even on a full-time basis by second-level State Department people, no matter how competent they are. There has to be the appointment of a full-time heavyweight negotiator, and that appointment should be made, I think, to Henry Kissinger. Now, Henry is devious, Henry is difficult, and some people think he's obnoxious, but he's a terrific negotiator. And I would suggest that the next president, be it Dukakis or Bush, would be well advised to give him the title of ambassador plenipotentiary, give him a year, and he will work out some settlement.
What does he think of this idea, let alone the description of him?
He'll kill me if he hears the program.
Well, I suspect it'll get back to him. I'd like to change subjects if I could and talk to you about the Iran-Contra affair. How serious was it as a foreign policy blunder, and how serious was it as a scandal?
It was more serious as a foreign policy blunder. And it was serious not for the points that have been emphasized most in the press, that is the trading arms for hostages. That certainly was a mistake. Or for even the transfer of the arms to the Contras, the proceeds from the arms, that might have been illegal. The fatal flaw in the policy was selling arms to Iran, period, because it is not in the interest of the United States, or of Israel for that matter, to have Iran win this war. And anything that was done that might have helped them, even marginally in that respect, was not in our interest. That was the basic mistake.
How about as a scandal? The president misleading the country, keeping Congress in the dark, laws being broken?
Well, as far as the scandal is concerned, I think that has been, if I may be permitted to say so, been built up in the media somewhat more than is justified. These were some very well-intentioned people. They thought they were carrying out serving in the interest of the country. I think it was a mistake, but I do not believe that it was one of those massive scandals that destroyed confidence of the people in the President of the United States.
Do you really believe that John Poindexter and Bill Casey diverted funds to the Contras without telling Ronald Reagan?
Well, they said that, and under the circumstances, I would believe them because John Poindexter said it under oath.
But on the other hand, let me just, if I could, one last question, Tom. Could that devious, obnoxious Henry Kissinger have carried out those kind of operations, sensitive, perhaps semi-legal or illegal operations in the White House? Would he have done that without telling you?
Now, let me say, I'm not saying it's devious and obnoxious. Other people do say that. But I would say that as far as Henry Kissinger is concerned, he wouldn't do it because he knows that he wouldn't get away with it if I were there.
Mr. President, you're an advocate of a strong presidency. You referred to it as the sovereign. A lot of people, however, see Iran-Contra and even Watergate as the tragic byproduct of a presidency that is too strong. People who come through those gates at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue believing that they have no allegiance other than to the president's wishes. Isn't one of the tests of a strong presidency a strong man controlling the people who work for him? And in this case, doesn't President Reagan fail that test because he simply didn't know what was going on in the basement of the White House?
No, I'm not going to suggest that President Reagan failed the test because only somebody that is there can really make that judgment. I think we have to understand, though, that we mustn't learn the wrong lessons from what has happened in Iran-Contra. Rather than saying that we have to turn over everything to the State Department now and weaken the NSA, that would be a terrible mistake. Let me tell you, we wouldn't have had the opening to China. We wouldn't have had SALT I with the Soviet Union. We wouldn't have had the peace agreement ending the war in Vietnam unless we had a strong NSC and, of course, strong leadership from the White House. So we need to strengthen the NSC rather than to weaken it. We need covert actions. We need to limit the number of people that are covert actions are, of course, are revealed to. I'd limit it to only 4, 2 in the House and 2 in the Senate. But the fact that this went awry must not mean that in the future we're going not to have covert actions or not have bold action. Those are the wrong lessons that could be learned. I would say, however, that you are absolutely right that a great responsibility is on whoever is president to see that when you have that much power, don't let it get out of line. I made, of course, very grievous errors in the Watergate matter. Fortunately, President Reagan didn't make that kind of error. He didn't have the problem of having to resign.
You're a student of history. Was there a Reagan revolution?
Well, the term revolution means many things to different people.
But the president's men say there's been a Reagan revolution.
Well, the president's men obviously are trying to say that Reagan made a difference. And the point is he did make a difference. He made a difference, for example, with regard to the way the United States was perceived all over the world. He reestablished within the American people themselves a sense of confidence that had been lost. There was a Reagan revolution insofar as our priorities are concerned. Right now, for example, it's very difficult for people to talk about spending more. They're talking about how they're going to save money. Now, of course, the Reagan deficit is responsible for that, but that also has denied the Democrats their bread and butter issue. And I would say, finally, as far as the Reagan Revolution is concerned, the attitudes on some of the social issues have changed. It is a revolution, I think, would be better stated if there's been a revolution in the way people approach issues, not a revolution in terms of what has been accomplished on those particular issues.
Do you think the more than $2 trillion spent on defense in the last 7 years has been wisely spent?
Never. The money spent in the Defense Department is never spent wisely. By that I mean there are many mistakes that are made. And the reason is that the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, and the Marine Corps are always fighting for their portion of the pie more than they're usually fighting for some of the other things that they should be fighting for. I don't mean that they aren't very loyal, very patriotic people, but that's the way the system works. It is very difficult to bring the Pentagon into line. I think Cap Weinberger was a fine Secretary of Defense, but he was representing the Defense Department rather than trying to carry out what I think could have probably served the country better by knocking heads together and getting more money for what we were spending on defense.
How would you go about solving the country's drug problem?
I'd appoint a czar. We talk about, for example, the Army, Navy, and the Marine Corps fighting for turf. That, of course, is a Washington disease. And in the drug problem, we've got about 14 or 15 agencies that are so busy fighting each other that they aren't devoting their attention to fighting the common enemy. There should be a czar in the White House who pulled all the drug activities from the Justice Department, the Treasury Department, and the Customs and all together with complete and total authority and backing by the President. Now, the other point, I know there's a little controversy in the campaign here as to whether you can use the Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marines, and I'd say yes. They shouldn't be used if necessary, but we have to remember the purpose of our armed forces is to deal with an enemy of the United States. And believe me, those that engage in selling drugs, shipping drugs to this country are killing people just as much as an enemy kills them. And if a way can be found, if it's necessary, in order to keep our borders clear, to have the Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine, or whatever, to stop the flow of drugs into this country, I would use them.
I'd like to go back, if I could, to something Tom brought up, which is the way Ronald Reagan does his job. I don't mean the big initiatives, but the day-to-day way he does his job, because it seems so different from the way you did the job. When you read that he's unable to remember whether or not he signed an intelligence finding, when you read that he doesn't know some of the basic facts of arms control, does that offend you at all?
No, it certainly doesn't offend me because he's been very successful. By that I mean...
Well, he's had his problems too, though, as a result of that.
But we've got to look at all of our presidents and their strengths and their weaknesses and so forth. And I had mine, and he has his. I would say in his case, he just does not spend that much time on details.
Isn't there a danger in that, though, Mr. President?
There can be a danger, particularly if you don't have staff people who spend that time. But Ronald Reagan, when he has good staff and when he can handle the big picture, he does a superb job. When his staff is weak, then you have problems.
What do you make of Mrs. Reagan's role, her influence on policy, her apparently extraordinary clout with the White House staff?
Well, Mrs. Reagan is to be admired for what she's done, for example, in the drug program. I admire that. I admire also her enormous loyalty and support to her husband. That's her only interest. She's not interested in herself. And I would say that as far as her influence is concerned, she has pretty good political antenna. And so her advice generally, I think, has been very good.
Mr. President, you made a reference in this program to the restlessness in the society, even in a time of prosperity, and Jesse Jackson is able to capitalize on. In fact, during the past 8 years of Ronald Reagan's administration, the rich have gotten richer, the middle class are struggling harder than they ever have in the past, and the poor are poorer. So there is a real foundation for that restlessness. And in fact, the Republican Party, according to Bob Dole, has to reach out to those minority groups and find a way to address the needs of the so-called underclass in America. Do you think that that has been a failure of the Reagan administration?
No, what has happened here is that, and we have to realize this, is that in order to afford what we want to do for people, it's necessary to produce wealth. Now, we can talk all we want about how we can distribute wealth, but if we don't have people out there producing wealth, forget it. Now, in this administration, we have to realize the economy has grown, there have been more jobs, we've been able to afford more, and we don't want to kill the goose that lays the golden egg. I do say this, and I agree with Bob Dole on this, and I know that George Bush feels the same way. We just don't stand on the record. We got to build on it. I pointed out a moment ago that Jesse Jackson has struck a responsive chord with the American people because he's talking about family, he's talking about drugs, he's talking about the poor, he's talking about the homeless. They are there. And I would hope that, and I am confident this will be the case, that in the next Republican administration, they will now be able to devote attention to those that have been left behind. Because you see, conservatism at its best is compassionate.
Do you think that this administration has been compassionate enough?
This administration has been compassionate in many ways, but the emphasis in this administration has been primarily on basically, I would say, to use a term or coin a term, it's been on the supply side. In other words, to build up the wealth of this country so that we can afford to do other things. Now let's see that now that we have done that, I think it's necessary to see what we can do to deal with these other problems.
Some people have called this decade the decade of greed. Is that an apt description?
There's nothing wrong at all with greed, provided that greed is one that contributes to the wealth of the country so that the wealth of the country can then handle some of the problems that people want. Let me tell you, if some people weren't greedy, we wouldn't have the tax money that we could even be talking about more for education, more for health, and the rest.
Mr. President, with a celebration of greed, we're going to have to break in for a moment. But we'll be back with some final questions about your place in history in just a moment when Meet the Press returns.
As far as there being a new Nixon and old Nixon, I would say that generally speaking, those that are discovering the new Nixon probably didn't know the old one.
When Radio Shack put their $849 computer on sale for only $599, I just had to have it because it runs the same IBM PC software I use at the office. I got this complete system, including color monitor, for only $899. And it came with 7 programs in one, like word processing, budgeting. My wife uses it to run her catering business.
Homework, Dad.
They use it so much, I'm thinking of getting my own.
Save $250 on a Tandy 1000SX, only $599 with software. Complete system only $899 at Radio Shack.
For as long as we've been pumping gasoline, we've been pumping a poison into our air, an invisible, odorless health hazard called carbon monoxide. It wasn't a major problem at first. There were simply fewer cars and fewer drivers on the road. But over the years, as we pumped more gasoline, the problem grew for everyone. And even though today's cleaner burning cars have helped reduce carbon monoxide levels, the problem persists for everyone. But part of a solution is already at the pumps in some states, in the form of ethanol-blended fuels. Ethanol blends reduce deadly carbon monoxide emissions significantly, and a detergent in ethanol keeps engines running cleanly. The complete solution isn't here yet, but one conclusion is perfectly clear. The more ethanol blends we pump into our cars, the less carbon monoxide we pump into our lungs.
Well, I was answering that question very precisely.
Mr. President, I talked to so many people this week in preparing for this interview, and I must say that, and I'm sure you won't be surprised to hear this, they have very ambivalent feelings about you. They think that you make great sense on foreign policy, perhaps more sense than almost anyone else on the public scene these days. But on the other hand, there is still a deep feeling about the breach of trust in Watergate. How do people reconcile that?
Well, it's very difficult to reconcile, and I understand that, because Watergate was a breach of trust. I think to keep it in perspective somewhat, and I think it is important that as we consider this historical segment of the program that we put it in perspective, that 1972, as you know, was a very big year. A lot of things were going on. Winston Churchill once wrote that strong leaders usually do the big things well, but they foul up on small things, and then the small things become big. I should have read that before Watergate happened. In 1972, we went to China, we went to Russia, we ended the Vietnam War effectively by the end of that year. Those were the big things. And then here was a small thing, and we fouled it up beyond belief. It was a great mistake, it was wrong, as I pointed out over and over again. But under the circumstances, now people, as they judge that period, have to see what we accomplished and what we did wrong. And for the future, I would advise all those that follow me in the position of president, do the big things as well as you can. But when a small thing is there, deal with it fast, get it out of the way, because if you don't, it's going to become big, and then it may destroy you.
Whenever you go public, and you are going to go public now with a series of interviews in association with the release of this book, 1999, there's a good deal of speculation about Richard Nixon trying to make a comeback. And there's always the question, what does Richard Nixon want? Do you want to erase the stigma of Watergate? Do you want to be a player again at the national table in the debate of national issues? Or are you just trying to sell your book? What does Richard Nixon want?
Well, as far as selling the book is concerned, that's no problem because it got a very good advance on it, and it isn't going to make any difference whether it sells that much or not. No, my purpose at the present time is, frankly, to get the message across. I have some very strong feelings about foreign policy. I've had a lot of experience, not just in Soviet-American relations, but in Chinese-American relations, in the Mideast, in Latin America, Africa, etc., Europe. I feel I want to pass on that experience before I'm too old to be able to do so, to articulate it. That's why I'm going out. As far as restoring my making a comeback. What am I going to come back to? We already have a very good mayor in
Saddle River.
Saddle River. Yes. And we have a very good governor, as somebody has suggested, in the state of New Jersey. It isn't a comeback. It isn't to be well thought of. But the purpose is to get a message across and then let history judge.
Mr. President, when you were describing Watergate as a small thing that happened in a busy year, I know that a lot of people will have trouble with that characterization because it was a break-in, after all, led by the President's men. And it wasn't just 1972. This went on through 1973 and into 1974 as well. It involved a conspiracy, the misuse of money, and it involved perjury. People went to jail for it. Is it fair, really, to characterize it only as a small thing that was a mistake?
Oh, no, I think you misheard me. I said it was a small thing that became a very big thing. It was a small thing, the break-in, and break-ins have occurred previously in other campaigns as well. At that point, we should have done something about it. We should have exposed it, found out who did it, rather than attempting, as was, to contain it, to cover it up. It was the cover-up that was wrong, and that was a very big thing. There's no question about that at all. You're absolutely right.
Mr. President, as you know, generations of Americans have been students of Richard Nixon, admirers and detractors. Even your admirers describe you as a complex man. We're all a little self-critical at some time in our lives, some more than others, of course. In the autumn of your years, as you are reflective about your own life's experiences, personal and as a politician, what criticism do you have with your own behavior or style or things that you've done?
As president?
As president or as a human being?
Well, we don't have much time to cover the human being. Let's start with the president. First, naturally, the Watergate matter should have been handled properly. I should have concentrated on it, and apart from the fact that it was wrong, it was stupid. And generally, I'm called many things, but not often am I called stupid. I would say the major mistake I made as president was one, and this will surprise you, was not doing early in 1969 what I did on May 3rd of 1972 and on December 15th of 1972. And that was to bomb and mine North Vietnam. I wanted to do it. I talked to Henry Kissinger about it, but we were stuck with the bombing halt that we had inherited from the Johnson administration, with Paris peace talks. I knew that just like the ceasefire talks down here in Nicaragua, I didn't trust them at all, and they proved to be, of course, phony. But if we had done that then, I think we would have ended the war in Vietnam in 1969 rather than in 1973. That was my biggest mistake as president.
And what about when you are self-critical of your personal style or how you treat people or how you look at the world? Do you see anything that you might have done differently?
Well, I suppose I could have treated the press better.
Well, I wasn't looking for that necessarily.
But then they might have treated me better. No, I think under the circumstances, it's very difficult for one to psychoanalyze himself. You know, I don't go much for this psycho-history. I don't go much for psycho TV shows either. I think they're rather revolting. And as far as sitting down and psychoanalyzing myself and saying, now, how could I have been a better person? It's just not my bag.
Well, let me just follow on to what Tom said. How do you think you will be remembered? You're a pretty good judge. You read a lot of history. Write me a paragraph that might be written around the turn of the century and the next century about Richard Nixon.
When you talk about writing a paragraph, John, it would be difficult for me because writing is very hard for me. I know that you fellows, you just type it right off. It comes off the top of your head.
You just try ad-libbing it, sir.
But under the circumstances like this book, it was hard work. I don't think I could do it in a paragraph. People say, will history treat you well? History will treat me fairly. Historians probably won't, because most historians are on the left, and I understand that. I would say that as people look back on the Nixon administration, they're probably most likely to remember 50 years from now, 100 years from now, that it made a difference on a very major issue. We changed the world. If it had not been for the China Initiative, which only I could do at that point, we would be in a terrible situation today, with China aligned with the Soviet Union and with the Soviet Union's power. The China Initiative hasn't brought peace to the world. we can't be sure what will happen, but without it, we would be in a terrible shape.
Do you think at all about how different the world would have been had you been able to finish your second term? I was thinking the other day probably Jimmy Carter would never have been president. Perhaps Ronald Reagan wouldn't have been. Do you have thoughts about what you could have accomplished in the rest of a second term and how, flowing from that, America would have been so different?
My priorities were these. One, interestingly enough, one of the first ones was the Mideast. That I talked about it over and over again with Henry Kissinger in February and March of 1973. Second was, we would not have lost the war in Vietnam. I would have seen to it that we would have forced the North Vietnamese to keep the Paris Peace Agreement, and that would have meant that we wouldn't have had basically what happened in all the places around the world, Cambodia, Laos, even what happened in Africa and even in Nicaragua. The other point is that I think we would have done something at home. There was an area particularly I was interested in, and that was to have a real welfare program. I am concerned about the fact that when you look at blacks, they are worse off today, generally speaking, on an average, than they were in 1966 when the Great Society program started. And the problem is the family. We've got to do something about that, and our family assistance program was the right way to go. I'm glad that Moynihan's following up on it today.
Mr. President, I'm sorry we're going to have to break it off. I want to thank you very much for coming in today and sharing very generously your thoughts with us. Appreciate it very much. My thanks also to my colleagues, Tom Brokaw and John Chancellor. And that's Meet the Press for this week. I'm Chris Wallace. For all of us here at NBC News, have a good week.
When Radio Shack put their $849 computer on sale for only $599, I just had to have it because it runs the same IBM PC software I use at the office. I got this complete system, including color monitor, for only $899. And it came with 7 programs in one, like word processing, budgeting. My wife uses it to run her catering business.
Homework, Dad.
They use it so much, I'm thinking of getting my own.
Save $250 on a Tandy 1000 SX, only $599 with software. Complete system only $899 at Radio Shack.
Over the years, America has established itself as a giant among exporting countries. But every year since 1975, we've imported more than we've sent abroad. It hurts our balance of trade and costs jobs. Fortunately, one export of ours has the potential to reverse the trend: America's agricultural abundance. It won't be easy, not with more and more foreign governments subsidizing their farmers' wheat, corn, soybean, and sugar crops on the world market. But the American farmer is the most productive farmer in history and stands ready to rebuild America's export business, literally from the ground up. At the Archer Daniels Midland Company, we're proud of our long-standing partnership with the American farmer. And we're committed to continue to seek out new markets for America's agricultural abundance all over the globe.
Meet the Press has been sponsored by the Archer Daniels Midland Company, ADM, supermarket to the world. For a printed transcript of Meet the Press, send $1 and a stamped self-addressed envelope to Kelly Press, Box 55358, Washington, D.C. 20011.
We thank you for watching, and remember, stay updated on breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or watch live on our YouTube channel.